everyone, welcome to Gruff Talk, where each week we explore everything to help you feel better, look better, live better, and age better. Today we're talking with neuroscientist Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, who wrote The Grieving Brain, the surprising science of how we learn from love and loss to get a better understanding about grief, one of the most complicated of all human experiences. I'm your host, Barbara Hannah Grufferman. I thought this was a good time to talk about grief. Everyone I know seems to be in some kind of state of grief. Since the start of the pandemic, there's been a profound sense of collective grieving. Then came the war in Ukraine, compounded by the seemingly endless mass shootings and increase in violence around the country. Grief is universal, but it's also very personal, affecting each of us in different ways, especially when you're grieving because you've experienced a personal loss. In July 2021, my mother passed away. In an effort to comfort me, someone told me that grief never really goes away. It just gets softer. Perhaps. But the impact of my mother's passing was anything but soft. The months leading up to her death, when I was overseeing her care, and then the months of grieving afterwards, took a tremendous toll on my body in ways I never thought possible. And I'm someone who takes health and fitness very seriously. But all of a sudden, my body seemed to be falling apart. Maybe it was grief. Maybe this has all been happening from much less self-care because of the grief. I don't know for sure, but when I posted this on social media and wrote that I felt as though I was recovering from a trauma, the floodgates opened up. Hundreds of women shared their own stories about grief and how grief had impacted their bodies, minds, and lives. I wanted to understand this better. I wanted to understand how grief, which seems to me to be an emotional experience, could have such an astounding impact on the body. I wanted to understand the process of grieving and whether we grieve forever and it just gets softer, as my friend said, or does it transition into something else? I also wanted to be better equipped to support those who are grieving. And lastly, I wanted to explore the different forms of grief, not only the feelings of deep grief that comes with the loss of someone you love and will miss forever, but I wanted to know if the term grief could be used to describe what we feel when we lose a job, an opportunity, a part of our body, a relationship, anything. My guest today is going to talk us through these very tough questions about grief, one of the most complicated and least understood of all human experiences. Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor is a psychologist and neuroscientist at the University of Arizona and heads the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab there. In her new book, The Grieving Brain, which I loved, Dr. O'Connor shares groundbreaking discoveries about what's really happening in our brain when we grieve and what that can mean for you. Welcome to Gruff Talk, Dr. O'Connor.
Oh, it's so nice to be here, Barbara. And please call me Mary Frances.
Okay, Mary Frances, thank you. Now, in your book, you state the experience of grief is different than grieving. Please explain these differences.
I realized that there was a difference between these two terms as I was doing research and trying to figure out what it was I was studying. But it became obvious to me that it was helpful for other people as well. And so grief is really that wave that overtakes you. It's a noun, right? It's that thing. Grieving, on the other hand, is the way that grief changes over time. It's a verb, right? And the way it changes over time means that grief won't ever go away, but that it's going to feel different at different points in the weeks and months and years following the death of a loved one. So that the first, 100 times, it may feel like, I'm not even going to get through this moment. This is just awful. And the 101st time, it may feel just as awful, but at least it may feel more familiar. Or you may develop over time an understanding of how to comfort yourself when you have a wave of grief. And that change over time means there's nothing wrong with feeling grief years after someone dies. It means that in that moment, you're aware of how important this person was who's died. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your grieving just because you have a wave of grief many years later.
So is it okay to grieve for the long haul? I know that there is now a recognized, is it a mental illness, a diagnosed mental illness where you continue to grieve and then it gets to a point where it's too long?
It's not really about how long, interestingly. In fact, this is people want to know when it's going to be over. And I think that's understandable because it's such an awful feeling. And at the beginning, it's so disorienting. You think, as you described, I feel like everything's different. I feel like the rug's been pulled out from under me. So I understand why people would want to know, when will this end? But I sometimes ask the question this way: when did you get over your wedding day? Right? Which is not really a question that makes any sense, right? How do you get over your wedding day? Well, the death of a loved one is a similar thing. It just changes you. It changes how you understand mortality. It changes how you understand the world and your role in the world. And so while there is not any getting over it, we do expect to see change over time. So I sometimes say grieving is a form of learning. And so when we think about prolonged grief disorder, what we're talking about is that there hasn't been change over time. So it's not that we're expecting grief to go away for anyone. As I said before, it can be years and years and decades later when you feel a wave of grief. But what we are expecting is that there's often change in the frequency or the intensity of the waves of grief, and also that a person generally feels that they understand and they can accept at some level what's happened in the bigger picture of their life. So people with prolonged grief disorder, we're not seeing any change over time, more than a year after the person has experienced this death, but also that it's preventing them from doing the things day to day that are important in their life. They can't get dinner on the table for their kids, for example, or
they become debilitated.
Yes,
it sounds like.
Exactly.
So what exactly is going on in the brain? Really, what changes are happening? I mean, now put on your neuroscientist hat, and what did you see from all the studies that you did, which really have been groundbreaking?
I did the first fMRI, functional neuroimaging study of grief, about almost 20 years ago now. And I think as I've looked across so many studies now that have been done, one of the things that became really clear to me is there's love first before there can be grief. And what I mean by that is when we fall in love with our spouse or our baby, a bond is formed, and that bond is physically encoded in your brain. The proteins are actually folded differently because you had this experience with your one and only. And it is when that bond has happened that then, if the person dies, something has to change in the brain to be able to update an understanding of the world. How do I predict their absence when I've always predicted their presence? And so this takes a long time for the brain. It takes time for the physical changes to happen in the brain, for our mind to understand that we're now carrying the absence of this person with us.
It's really remarkable, the actual physical changes that are taking place. When I read about that in your book, and then in some of the videos I've seen on YouTube and the like, explaining this further, I think it's so helpful for people to understand that there really is something happening up there that is causing a lot of what they're feeling.
Yeah.
And for, how long it's taking to get over. And we never really, as you pointed out, we never really get over it.
No.
As my friend put it to me, it hopefully gets softer. And I know that's true of me as well. I was profoundly
Yeah.
filled with grief. And as you said, it was like a wave, a tidal wave was hitting me. And then
Yeah.
as I go on, of course, it's been many months now, and it has gotten softer. Although I would like to, and we will get to the physical impact that it can have on us. But first, let's talk about emotions that are kind of rooted in grief. When someone dies, I mean, I guess depending on the relationship you had with that person that you bonded with, as you just explained, can, indicate what the other emotions may be: guilt, blame. And you mentioned, of course, sadness, but you mentioned yearning as well. So talk us through some of these emotions, please.
When we bond with that other person, part of that bond is a deep understanding that I'll always be there for you and you'll always be there for me, right? You are my special someone and I am your special someone. And so when we think about it that way, when that person dies, that relationship, that belief, it doesn't change right away. And that seems so strange because on the one hand, we have memories. We were there, say, for example, like yourself when your mom died, or we got that phone call. We know that the reality, our memories tell us that this person has died. But on the other hand, there's this attachment belief that comes from that bond. And if you think about it, a person doesn't have to be in our presence for us to believe they are there. Right. So we wouldn't be able to kiss our spouse goodbye and let them go to work every day if we didn't have some deep belief that they would be back and we would be back at the end of the day. And so when someone is not in our presence, someone with whom we have this bond, the brain's solution to that is, well, then just go get them. Right. It's obvious. And so that belief doesn't change right away just because we have these memories of the person's death. And so you have these two streams of information that conflict, right? On the one hand, you know they've died. On the other hand, you feel like they're still just going to walk through the door again, right? And so that disorientation, it takes a long time to understand. And so where some of those feelings come from is if part of you still has this belief that they're alive or that they're out there somewhere, then all these emotions of feeling anger, like, how are you not coming back to me? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Or self-blame, like, what could I have done to prevent this, right? To enable you to come back to me. And then just that simple yearning, all of the chemicals in our brain are really motivating us to be with our loved ones, to bring us back together, right? That dopamine and oxytocin and opioids. And when that person has died initially, those chemicals don't necessarily go away. And so we have this deep yearning. I think of it as like hunger or thirst for the other person. And so it makes sense, I think, that we would have such strong emotions while our brain is still trying to work out, wait, what's happening? I'm living in these two worlds at once.
And I could imagine too, and I know, again, I'm speaking from my own personal experience here, that not only is there that deep sense of loss of the person, but also of everything connected to the person. So in my case, I was very involved in my mother's caregiving, especially during the last few years of her life and absolutely the last few months of her life. Yeah. And so that became part of my daily routine. So I found myself also not only missing my mother, the person, but also that routine that was a part of my everyday life. And so that just, for me, compounded. It wasn't like there was this distance, geographical distance, which maybe made it a little easier. And I know that was when I posted about this in social media, that was true of so many people who responded, that they also felt this profound sense of loss of routine. And there was a big gap in their lives now.
You have to update every habit. You know what I mean? Like so much of our lives is bound up with that other person. And you think how often you previously had that push notification from your brain, like, oh, when is my mom's doctor's appointment? Or, oh, I should check in on mom, see how she's doing. Or I need to call, and all of those push notifications, they keep coming for a while. And until you can sort of update, you're going to keep picking up the phone, right? To call that person and then realize, oh, wait, they're not here. Or you're going to wake up in the morning and roll over to see them and then recognize that they're not there. So even just at the level of habits, of routines, as you describe, the brain has to make all these updates. But the other thing that I think is so interesting is you describe yourself there as a daughter. You also describe yourself as a caregiver. And when I think about grief, and I believe the brain thinks about grief in this way as well, which is that when we're in a relationship with someone, it changes our own identity, right? The word daughter, it implies two people, doesn't it? The word caregiver implies two people. The word spouse or sister or any of those terms, even though we're using them to describe ourselves, it's actually about there is this other person in the world. And so there's this
never thought of that.
Right?
I never thought about that. It is fascinating. Wow.
And so in the brain, it isn't just that there's representation of me and representation of you, but when we're bonded with someone, there's representation of we, right? And that we is very confusing when the you isn't in the material world. And so trying to figure out, well, what does it mean to be a good daughter in the world if my mom isn't here, if I can't take care of her? What does it mean to be a parent in the world if my child has died, right? How do I even describe myself? How is a widow different from being married, et cetera? So the part of the reason I think it's helpful to think about this, that we lose a part of ourselves, and people will describe it that way, don't they? Like, I feel like I've lost a piece of myself. The reason I think this is so helpful is it helps us to understand other kinds of loss, that question that you had. Mm-hmm. So when you lose a job, for example, or you retire, that is a part of who you are. So I'm a professor, right? And there will come a day where I can't describe myself as a professor. That's a big shift in my identity, right?
Yes.
In losing a piece of myself. And so, of course, that's going to feel like grief, or losing a piece of your health, right? Or losing in a divorce or an estrangement from a grandchild, right? You're losing a piece of yourself, and that feels like grief as well.
Yeah, and it's so important that we're talking about this because for the most part, the audience of Gruff Talk are women in midlife, and they're experiencing almost many of those things that you just described. There is a lot of loss involved as you get older in life and you experience life in all of its wonders.
Yeah.
And thank you for kind of applying what you learned about grief and loss of a loved one to these other forms of loss. Yeah, it's so important. And Mary Frances, you heard my brief story about my mom and how really my body took a beating since my mother passed away. I mean, was it coincidence? Maybe. I feel probably not. I think it was maybe a combo plan, but it's important to point out that I'm a very healthy woman. I'm a runner. I eat well. I get enough sleep. I really believe in self-care, and I've been applying self-care principles to myself since I turned 50 and had this aha moment. So this physical manifestation of grief, if that's what we can call it, it was a shock to me. But then so many others shared their own experiences again when I posted this on social media. So please explain to us what is happening to our bodies during the grieving process. And do you consider this a form of trauma?
That's a good question. I'll take the first part first. Mm-hmm. And this was honestly why I got so interested in grieving in the first place. In part, I guess. There is a finding, an actual fact, that if a person loses their spouse, let's say a man loses his wife, in the next 6 months, he is twice as likely to die as a man who is the same in every way except he remains married. And I thought, wow, if there is an example of an emotional, social event that changes our physiology, death is a pretty clear outcome, right?
That's
and
incredible.
That we can, right? Isn't that amazing?
It's amazing.
It's incredible. For women, it's slightly less than twice as high, but it is still a very big jump in the risk of mortality. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean it happens to everyone, clearly. Just because the risk goes up, it doesn't happen to everyone, clearly. But it made me start to think, well, what would the mechanisms be for that? How do we get from I've been there when my partner died to I'm in the ER and I've had a heart attack, right? Like, what's the span there physically that's happening? And so I started to look into cardiovascular and immune changes that happen in the body, endocrine changes that happen in the body. And some of those are due to stress, of course. And I believe some of them are also due to the fact that our relationships, especially people we live with, they help to regulate our own physiology, right? Think about when you go to bed at night. You can smell your partner, they're warm next to you. You probably went to bed at the same time, or you have some routine where you do this. All of these are regulating all those diurnal changes in your cortisol level and your other hormones. And so when that person is suddenly gone, our body has to regulate without that person, without those inputs that it's gotten every single day. So on the one hand, there's the stress, and we know that people's cortisol, a stress hormone, goes up after the death of a loved one. We also know that their heart rate tends to go up and their blood pressure tends to go up. But research shows us, studies of bereaved people, that for most of us, by 6 months, the blood pressure is back to where it was before, heart rate is back to where it was before. For some people, the cortisol remains high. And the reason that that's important is cortisol, the stress hormone, has a big impact on our immune system. And so we know, for example, in older adults who are widowed, they actually don't respond as well to vaccinations. So the pneumonia vaccine doesn't necessarily take as strongly in someone who's been recently widowed. And
incredible.
Isn't that just amazing?
Yes, I never heard that. That's crazy.
It is crazy.
Yeah.
And so we know that these changes in stress hormones and the changes in all the habits you were talking about. I can't fall asleep now because I'm not, because I'm thinking about this person who's died, or all my routines have changed and I can't bring myself to go to bed. All of those changes in our health are impacting our hormones and downstream our inflammation levels. And so the other piece I would add is just that caregiving in and of itself, we know, is a very stressful process. It is one of the biggest stressors. So even during caregiving, we see changes in the caregiver's immune system, for example. And so that also can then persist. You can sort of be in, just as you described it, kind of a debilitated state by the time that the death happens. And then, you're sort of dealing with it after that. The primary thing I would say about all of this is these are things that can be evaluated in your regular doctor's office, right? So now is the time to think about your self-care. When was the last time you went to the dentist, right? When was the last time you had a mammogram? You should maybe go get your annual exam and have your blood pressure checked, because all these things, they can be treated in a normal way, but now might be a time to return to some of that self-care.
Oh, that's such good advice. Yeah, thank you for that. And you did mention cardiovascular issues, and I'd like to just add a question about that. This whole thing about the broken heart syndrome. We started to hear about that, a few years ago. I know I did, but it's an actual thing. It's an actual thing. So it's very real. Tell us about that. Why does it happen? Well, I think I understand why it happens, but what's going on with that? What is it?
The troubling thing, the difficult thing is that the broken heart phenomenon gets used in two different ways. And so I always have to sort of make the distinction. On the one hand, the thing I already described to you, where people are more likely to die themselves after the death of a loved one, that is often called the broken heart phenomenon, right? You can see why, the death due to a broken heart from losing this person. But those deaths aren't necessarily cardiovascular, right? So it could be caused by pneumonia or, stroke or something else. There is another way that the broken heart phenomena gets used, which is actually called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, which is probably why people say broken heart phenomena instead, right? But
yeah,
Takotsubo,
a lot easier.
Takotsubo cardiomyopathy means that the heart swells, and this can happen after a number of different stressful events, but it often happens, well, I shouldn't say often, it can happen in particular after the death of a loved one. So it often appears, for example, that the person is having a heart attack, but actually it's these changes in the heart that resolve themselves over time. And so it gets used in cardiology in that very specific way. But then there's also this phenomenon, which I sometimes call the widowhood effect instead of the broken heart phenomenon, to make the distinction. But I think you can see how we can have how both are true.
And is it the shock of it too? I mean, can actual shock cause this to happen as opposed to, stress from the grieving and the loss of someone?
It's such a good question. I will say we're still very much at the beginning of understanding this. I can say that in the first 24 hours after the death of a loved one, the chance of heart attack goes up 20-fold.
Yeah.
So
very unfortunately, we heard this happen to the husband of one of the teachers who was part of that terrible
in Uvalde.
mess.
Yes,
terrible.
That's right. Terrible.
Yeah,
and so that's an example, right?
A
where we
terrible
do think,
example, but yes, an example. Absolutely.
So we do think that acute stress can have that kind of impact, but there are then also these lingering impacts. And so that's why more research needs to be done to really understand for whom is this happening and what kinds of risk factors could we evaluate. I think that bereavement in and of itself is a risk factor. And as our medical establishment starts to understand that better, I think asking questions about bereavement hopefully will become a part of general medical care.
Oh, absolutely. And so everyone listening, if you are experiencing bereavement, grief at this time, you should really pay attention to any of these symptoms you may have and maybe go ahead and get that checkup, have things checked out because, you really want to take better care of yourself, especially during this very difficult time. After this short break, we'll explore the role of resilience in getting through grief. We're back with my guest, Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, author of The Grieving Brain, the surprising science behind how we learn from love and loss. So, Mary Frances, there are trajectories of grief. One of the things you learned in your research is that resilience is a part of that trajectory. What role does resilience play in grief, and how can people who are grieving learn to embrace resilience?
So this was research that was done from a very long 10-year study and has now been replicated many times. But this original study, part of what was so unique about it was, if you think about it, to really understand what is the process after the death of a loved one, it can help to know what was going on before the death of a loved one, right? And so this study, isn't that interesting?
Yep.
And so this study recruited couples to participate where one of them was over 65. That was it. That was the entry criteria. No one was sick. No one had died. And then followed these couples for 10 years. And when one of the couple died, they re-interviewed the person at 6 months and 13 months and a number of different times later to see what was the change over time for this person and what were the things prior to the death that might have impacted the trajectory of their grieving, what their grieving process looked like. So it's important because in science, we have this very important principle called random sampling. And the idea here is if you put out a flyer that says, please participate in this grief study, you're going to get a self-selected group of people who say, oh, I'm having trouble grieving. I'll participate in this study, for example.
Right.
But what we really want to know is, how does everybody handle bereavement, right? And so this meant that it was a randomly sampled group. And what was so amazing was the most common trajectory was that people were doing okay before a loved one died, and they were doing okay after a loved one died. And we called this resilience. Now, that is not to say that they didn't experience suffering. It's not to say they didn't experience sadness. But in terms of their life being completely turned upside down, or their levels of depression getting into what we would consider a clinical range, that was actually not true for most people. And I'll tell you, clinicians were really shocked by this. But it's because we see the people who are having trouble when they're grieving, right? And so it influences our perception of what grieving looks like. So I've had many people say to me, I feel awful. My mom died, and I feel like I'm doing okay. I'm not actually overwhelmed. And so we don't realize this is actually very common. So people are resilient.
That's so wonderful to hear. And I've always been so impressed and amazed by the strength of the human spirit. Like when you read about something so dreadful happening to someone, and yet they are moving on with life. Their life didn't end, right? It didn't end with that loss.
Yeah.
And that is resilience. I mean, that there is resilience. So what you're saying is your research and other experts' research shows that most of us do have that resilience. Most of us do. So everyone, we just have to kind of dig deep. You have to dig deep and get it. Pull it up.
It is.
Or it doesn't just kind of happen.
I think it's a combination of things. What we do know is that first 6 months can still be very tumultuous for people.
Yes,
so I don't want people to think.
I found the first 6 months, I really was unmotivated to do a lot of the things I needed to do, wanted to do. But then somehow, this is again my personal experience, I did snap out of it and evolved to a different trajectory.
And I think one of the things that we know is social support is so important. So it is the case that when people have loved ones around them who are helping them get through that really difficult acute grieving, whether that's, bringing them groceries or taking them on a walk or just taking them to the movies and not talking about anything, but, getting out of the house.
Right.
When people have support, we know that they do better over time, that resilience is actually maybe a community level thing and not just an individual thing.
Yeah, it does take a village. Yes. I think this is true. I've always loved that expression. Thank you, Hillary Clinton.
Yes.
You reference, and to me, this is so important too. You reference toxic positivity in your book. So, and I think I get what that means. It's like, okay, buck up. Your mom passed away 6 to 8 months ago, whatever, buck up. Yeah. How can we comfort and support others who are grieving without urging them to, get on with your life already before they're actually ready? What do we do?
I'll give you an example. I have a fairly small, close-knit group of friends. And in the past year, one of them, he took care of his mom who was dying of cancer, and she passed away. And about 3 or 4 months later, the group of us some had been golfing, and then we got together and in the parking lot as we're sort of going our different ways, he just sort of blew his stack about something. And we all sort of looked at each other like, oh, what is happening? And later I said to our friends, I was like, look, you have to remember his mom died like a few months ago. The volume dial on all his emotions are going to be turned up right now, And we have to sort of give the benefit of the doubt in those circumstances. No one was connecting the thing he was angry about with his mom dying. But he said later, I feel like I should be happy when I'm with you guys. And sometimes I just don't feel happy. And it's hard for me that I feel really disconnected. I think this is what happens if there's this expectation. And often this expectation is in our culture, right? That you should be enjoying yourself,
especially
right?
in America, like you can do it.
Exactly.
Right? Mm-hmm.
And if you don't feel that way, then having people who are sort of trying to cheer you up can just make you feel more disconnected.
Mm-hmm.
And so the goal really, when we're supporting people who are grieving, is to be with them, right? So to say to them, I can't know what you're feeling, right? Because everyone's experience is different. But I want you to feel like you can tell me about it if you want to. Or I'm also okay with just being here. And I can see a future where you don't feel this overwhelmed. And even though you can't see it right now, I'm going to be with you until we get there, right? Mm-hmm. So it's much more about being with, which is sort of the empathy side, rather than trying to change how they feel. They will naturally have this
evolve.
Exactly. There will be change over time.
Mm-hmm. That's such great advice to really help someone just to be. Sometimes just being is okay. You don't even need to talk, just being there.
Yeah.
I love what you said, that offering that little glimmer of hope. You may not see it right now, but it's there. That light
that's right.
The end of that tunnel is there. I can see it for you.
When I've had my own grief, the two most helpful things that a friend did was my best friend told me, you can call me even if it's the middle of the night. And she sent me this card that said, a true friend can call at 4 a.m. And I put it on my fridge. And the other thing she said is, you're doing really well in an impossible situation. And it was so, because you're trying so hard when you're grieving, you're trying to get your shoes to match when you get out the door. And to have someone recognize that no matter how you're doing, you're actually doing pretty well considering what you're dealing with was very reassuring.
Yes. Thank you for that. Mary Frances, thank you so much for joining me today, talking about such a complicated, difficult, we don't know enough about it.
Yeah.
This thing that we call grief. Everyone, there will be links posted so you can learn more about Dr. O'Connor, her work on grief, and of course about her really amazing and very helpful to me personally, her book, The Grieving Brain. Dr. O'Connor, Mary Frances, thank you. Before we wind down our discussion, please, if you don't mind, share 3 most important thoughts, like little thoughts you'd really like the Gruff Talk audience to take away from our conversation today, if you would.
Sure. I think one is remembering that grief is different from grieving. It's okay to have grief many years later. Another is that grieving is a form of learning. Hopefully that makes it a little more familiar, because we've all been learning our whole lives. And that's what grieving is, trying to learn, how do I make a meaningful life now? And let's see, the third one is go get your annual checkup with your doctor.
Yeah, really great. Get that self-care back on track.
Exactly.
Thank you again so much, Mary Frances. I really appreciate your being here with us today.
Thanks for having me, Barbara, and thanks for bringing this conversation to people. It's important.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. If you enjoyed this episode of Gruff Talk, please do 2 things. First, share it with all your friends and family, and subscribe to Gruff Talk wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, so you never miss a single episode. Until next time, remember this: we can't control getting older, but we can control how we do it. Talk to you soon. Age Better Podcast is a proud member of the Sound Advice Network. Sound Advice, women's voices amplified.